let's think again about the distribution of heights of women in the US, because that's an example that we can all think about. So suppose that we're going to assume the mean of all women's heights is maybe 65 inches, 5'5". That's a guess, but it's not a bad guess. And suppose that we have an estimate that, I don't know, maybe 95% of women's heights are between 61 inches, 69 inches, 5'1" and 5'9". That's just a guess, but it's not a terrible guess. So if we're going to assume that 95% of the time women's heights are between 61 and 69, if we think the distribution of heights follows a normal curve, it follows a bell shape, if we think that 95% of the time women's heights are between 61 inches and 69 inches, that implies that we think the standard deviation of women's heights is 2. Because we're saying that 65 plus 4 and 65 minus 4 are the bounds for 95% of women's heights. If this is a normal distribution, then plus or minus 2 standard deviations should include 95% of the observations, and so that implies the standard deviation is 2 and the variance is 4. In other words, if y represents the height of a particular woman, we're saying that women's heights follow a normal distribution with mean 65 and variance 4, and that's what's drawn here. Now I want to think about a different idea, though. Suppose that what we're doing is trying to learn about women's heights. So we don't actually know that the average height of women in the US is 65 inches, but what we're going to do is to collect some data to try to estimate that number. So suppose I go out and find 100 women and measure their heights. Now I have a sample of size 100. If you agree with me that 95% of women probably have heights maybe between 5'1" and 5'9", now let's think about what range we'd expect to see for the average of 100 women's heights. Again, I wouldn't be surprised to see a woman who was 61 inches, 63 inches. I wouldn't be surprised to see a woman who was 69 inches or 5'9". But if you have 100 women and you take the average of their heights, it would be pretty shocking if the average of 100 women's heights was 5'1". It would be pretty shocking if the average of 100 women's heights was 5'9". If I have a sample of size 100 and I average together those women's heights, I would expect the average to be much closer to 65 than I'd expect the height of any one particular woman to be. So let's draw a picture of what that sample might look like. This is my population. And here's my sample, perhaps of size 100. And if I have 100 women, the picture should look very similar. In other words, about 95% of the time, their heights should be between 61 and 69 inches, and the average should be somewhere around 65, but probably not exactly equal to 65. So this is the distribution of heights that I observe in my sample. This is the distribution of all women's heights. But what I'm saying is that I now want to record the mean of these 100 women's heights. So suppose I have my 100 women, and the mean of their heights happens to be 64.5. So I'm going to draw a little box right there to represent that. Okay. And it's not surprising that the mean of 100 women's heights would be 64.5, because that's pretty close to 65 inches. Now I'm going to erase this, because we're going to imagine that we're doing this study again. I'm again going to sample 100 women at random from the population in the US. And when I do this, I would again expect that the sample would have approximately the same distribution as the population, but the mean in this sample will not be exactly the same as the mean in the previous sample. Perhaps the mean of these women's heights is 66. Okay. And I can think about doing this process repeatedly. If I repeatedly sample women at random from the population, I repeatedly generate samples of 100 women, and each time I draw a random sample, I record the mean of those 100 women's heights. If I do that, I would expect most of those means to be very close to 65. I would not expect them all to be exactly equal to 65, but I'd expect them to be close to 65, and importantly, I'd expect them to be closer to 65 than individual women's heights are. We represent the mean of the women's heights in a sample by y bar instead of y. So the bar means that we're talking about the sample mean. And what we're showing here in this example is that the sample means are going to follow a normal distribution with the same mean as the population distribution, but a smaller variance. Let's talk about each component of what I've written here. First, let's think about these two 65s. This 65 represents the mean of the population. In other words, the mean of all women's heights in the population of the US, 65 inches, we're guessing. Okay, then what about this 65? What does that indicate? That says if I sample 100 women from the population and write down the mean of their heights, and then I again sample 100 women from the population and write down the mean of their heights, and I do this repeatedly, so I have a whole bunch of sample means, a whole bunch of means of 100 women, the average of all those sample means will be 65. In other words, the value we expect to see, the average we expect to see for the sample mean is the same as the mean in the population itself. And that should make sense, because why would it be anything else, right? Why would we expect the mean of 100 women's heights to, on average, be anything other than the mean in the population? Okay, what about this quantity? We said that the variance of women's heights in the US perhaps is 4. And here I've said that the variance of the sample means is 4 over 100. Where does that come from? Intuitively, we would not be surprised if a particular woman is 5'1" or 5'9", but we would be really surprised if the average of 100 women's heights was 5'1" or 5'9". The amount by which the sample means deviate from this average of 65 should be a lot less than the amount by which an individual woman's height deviates from 65. So we're happy that this variance is smaller than this one, because that makes intuitive sense.